Welcome. This is a short video to show you the Key Biodiversity Area multi-site proposal and nomination form. This proposal form is what we'll be using not only for multiple sites, but also for single sites from now on. And it's a form that will eventually become replaced by an online proposal system. But it can still be useful in helping check for KBA status if you have your global and site values for your trigger species or ecosystems. The form consists of 6 main sheets. The first introduction sheet is just instructions for completing, gives you some ideas of particular colors that occur on the sheets, and also a short summary at the bottom of the 6 main sheets where you'll fill data in. Sheet 1 is where you'd put in information about the proposer, who you are, where you come from, your contact details. An important component of this part of the sheet is you sign at the bottom here that you're willing for your data to be stored in the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas and used for the purposes of KBA identification. And that will include storage of personal information data, which is held in a secure format. And there's details about how the data are held in this section at the bottom. The second sheet is where you would put in all the data about a site. So each site would be on a separate row. And if you know the site rec ID number, which is the number that's used in the World Database Key Biodiversity Areas, you can put that number in the first cell here. If it's a site that you're proposing that's completely new, then you wouldn't have that number. You would only put this number in if you're adding a trigger element to the Key Biodiversity Area. So if not, you can then put any number or letter, number, code that identifies that particular site. The reason you need these codes is that on subsequent sheets, you'll also be putting the same codes when you're referring to that site, and it'll then pick up the names and everything that's entered on this sheet. You can find the site rec ID numbers for existing Key Biodiversity Areas when you go to the Key Biodiversity Area website. And if you go to where the data are shown and click on the particular site you're interested in, the number at the end of the URL is shown, and that is the site rec ID number. This sheet you would put in site name in English, and if there's a different name, a national name that isn't in English characters, you can put that name there as well. Country is selected from standard drop-down list. The purpose of the proposal, are you proposing a new KBA that amalgamates existing KBAs, adding a biodiversity element to an existing KBA? There's several different options there that you can select from. And then what we also want you to do is tell us which KBA criteria you've assessed for species and ecosystems at that site. You just select yes or no for each of the different criteria. For criterion E, you would fill in a completely different report. That's the irreplaceability analysis. And if you want to do a criterion E analysis, please contact the KBA Secretariat and I can give you more information about that. The names of any existing KBAs that are intersected by a site, if you're replacing them, you would put in here. If you're updating a qualifying element, there's also a way to flag how that is being changed. So is it changes in the criteria? That's unlikely, but maybe things like the taxonomy of the species has changed, or the change in the red list status of the species has changed, all of those sorts of things. Then state, province, site area, latitude, mid-latitude, mid-longitude of the sites, lowest altitude, highest altitude, or bathymetry. if it's a marine site. And if to help us know which is which, you either select altitude or bathymetry with this column. And then system, is it terrestrial, marine, freshwater, or subterranean? And some sites you may have multiple systems, so we allow you to select up to 4. And then you get a bunch of fields here where you would put a reasonable amount of text. And this text will be shown on the fact sheets in the future. First one is, why is the site being nominated as a KBA? And here you will put in something about the species and ecosystems that trigger KBA status. Site description is a general description about the site. If you look at some of the fact sheets, you'll get an idea of what that can be, but it's usually a description of the main types of habitats, where it occurs in the country, how it's managed to some extent. And then in the third cell here, we want more information about why you think the site is a manageable site. So key biodiversity areas are identified not only for the specific threshold areas of for a trigger species or trigger ecosystem, but they're also need to be manageable sites. And so what we want is some justification why you think it's manageable. And then also a justification of why the boundaries were placed where you've put them. In the case of existing sites, you wouldn't have to fill these two in if that information already exists. And it asks, are you identifying a boundary file? And this would be a shape file that you would be submitting, an Esri shape file. And then if you know how much of it is covered by an existing protected area, you can select from a range of intervals there. And if it's covered by a protected area, we want to know what the name of that protected area is. We also ask the question, how's it related to the protected area boundary? If it KBA boundary doesn't intersect with the protected area, it exactly follows the boundary. And so there are other options there. What you'll notice, some of these titles are in bold and some are in non-bold. Bold text is required fields that we want you to fill in. The non-bold text is recommended, but it's not required information. So if you have the information, please fill in. And so there's some questions about other biodiversity values. Is a site managed by indigenous people or people with customary rights? What sort of land use regimes? And then is there a recognized OECM in the protected planet that overlaps this site? And if so, give the name, otherwise leave it blank. You can add any additional notes in this section that if you want us to be aware of it in the proposal process. Then finally, we want a section on who has been involved in both the academic, scientific consultations for the proposal for that site, and then who additionally has been consulted, such as potentially protected area managers, protected area authorities, local communities. So we want some idea of who has been involved in the proposal process. And then you can also place here a list of people who know the site and could be potential reviewers for the site. And there's a gray section here, which is where you wouldn't fill this in, but this is where the regional focal point will give comments about specific aspects of the site proposal. And then here's a section where you can respond to those comments. And then when it's not finally nominated to the KBA Secretariat for inclusion in the database, there may be a few additional comments to add there. You have a place to respond to comments, and then there's a final decision on whether the site's confirmed as a KBA or not. So all of this sheet is focused on details about the site, and each site has its own separate row. So if you're just proposing for one site, you would just complete one row of this worksheet. Sheet 3 is the biodiversity elements sheet. And this is where you would put in, for each row, a different species, and there may be multiple species for one site. So at the beginning on the left here, you need the same numbers that you placed on the sheet site in those same positions. If, for example, we had chosen 1 and we call it new site as the name of the site, then on this sheet, we would put in sheet number 1 for the site, and it would be new site, and you could put this down for several species. These pink columns are automatically calculated for you, so you don't need to put anything in them. And here, then you would list different species. So you'd initially have the species common name and the scientific binomial. If there isn't a common name, just leave it blank. If you can find out the SIS number, if it's a red listed species or species assessed on the red list, the SIS number is obtainable again in the URL of that site. The species ID number in the World Database of KBAs, you can add that, and on the KBA website under the tools section we have placed a list of both species rec IDs and SIS IDs for all species in the current list, SIS list for the red list. If the species is not on either list, you can put your own species code here. But we will then want some justification of why the species is recognized as a species. So we'd like you to dig out the publications which show that it's a new species. So we'll just call it species X. And you can select taxonomic group here, and here we have a list of all the different taxonomic groups recognized in the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. Because it's a long list, you can type in certain letters and it then select from a reduced list. Red list category, you'll select if it's assessed on the red list. In the case of this species, a new species, it wouldn't have been, so it wouldn't have a threat status. So you would put not assessed, which is at the bottom. If it is assessed and you know that the species is vulnerable, then you would put what criteria has it been assessed by on the red list. So it might be criterion A2, for example. If the species has been assessed on a different system other than the IUCN red list, for example, the G-rank system of North America, then you can also state, you would put under the red list listing the equivalent and then state that it's assessed on the G-rank system. If you're assessing the species under A1C or A1D, which is the particular case where the species is declining rapidly, not based on restricted populations, then so under the red list criteria be assessed under A1, A2 or A4, then you would not change this to a yes, but otherwise leave it at no. The species is range restricted. You would, this is for criterion B2, where you have specific range restricted species, you would select yes. At the end of the sheets at the bottom here, we've put some notes for aiding. And under the first set of notes, we give the threshold range size for groups, taxonomic groups that have been comprehensively assessed. If it's within one of those groups, then you would check the range size of the species. And if it's smaller than this range size, then it would be a range restricted species. For taxonomic groups that aren't comprehensively assessed, you'll use the default 10,000 kilometers squared as a range restricted species. So going back to sheet 3, if the species has a range that's smaller than those values, then you would change this to yes. And here we ask you to state, is it based on the 25th percentile, which is for the comprehensively assessed groups, or the standard 10,000 square kilometers for groups that haven't been comprehensively assessed. For applying B3A or B3B, whether it's an ecoregion or bioregion restricted species, you can select one of those. And again, under the notes, we give some indication which taxonomic groups you would assess under B3A or B3B. So for comprehensively assessed groups, mammals, for instance, you would assess them under B3B, whereas amphibians, you'd assess them under B3A, ecoregion restriction. All taxonomic groups that aren't comprehensively assessed, you'll assess under ecoregion until they're more comprehensively assessed, because ecoregions will be nested within bioregions. Then if it's the ecoregion or bioregion that you're assessing the species against, you would give the name of that ecoregion, bioregion the species is restricted to. We're going to have a list of ecoregion, bioregion restricted species, which will be on the website fairly soon. If it's on that list, you would select yes. If it's not, then you would say no, but then you would also help give information about why you think it should be added to that list. And then put in here the number of species required to meet B3A or B3B status. And that is available also on the, it'll be available on the KPA website. And for the species, which assessment parameter did you apply? Is it number of mature individuals, area of occupancy, extent of suitable habitat, range, etc.? And you can give a minimum, best, maximum value for the global data. Only give a minimum, best, and maximum if you have all those values. If you just have one value, then put it as best. You don't need to fill in the other columns. And then where do you get that information from? If it's a report or a paper, give the list and, if possible, a URL link to it. And then you can add any notes on the global data if you want to clarify anything. Then we have a bunch of columns that ask whether evidence that the species is present. So what is that evidence? When was it seen? So in the second one column is we want a year in which the species was definitely seen as being present. We want an estimate of the minimum number of reproductive units, or at least a minimum threshold that's met. What are 10 reproductive units comprised of? So if it was pairs of birds, it would be 10 pairs of birds. But if it's something like an elephant seal where you have one bull and several females, then you would need 10 females and one bull. Source of reproductive unit data, where do you have evidence that the species is present and that there's that many reproductive units? This can be a publication, or it can be an individual who has been to the site, seen that number of reproductive units in a particular year, in which case we would want the name of that person together with the year and how many were seen on that visit. And then for the KBA that's being proposed, or this element that's being added to a KBA, you would say what the site estimate for the species is. So if you're using number of mature individuals, you can put in here the minimum, best, and maximum. Again, if you only have one value, put in the best, but if you have 95% confidence limits on that value, then put in the minimum and maximum. And then there's a pull down list of how that estimate is derived. And then again, source of the data, if it's published anywhere, or if not, if it's an individual scientist, unpublished records, give the name of that scientist and his contact details in an email or something. And then the year that that population estimate was made. If you're applying A1, B2, B3, it's usually that the species is regularly held in one or more life cycle stages. If you're applying D1A, you would have aggregations that are predictably held. If you're D2, site is supported by a site as a refugium. and if you're D3 produced by sites as a recruitment source. So you need to select which of these you're applying dependent on the criteria that you apply. So if you're applying A1, B1, and D1 to a species, you need to put them on separate lines, the same species on a different line. And if the seasonal distributions which can apply to all of these, is it a breeding, non-breeding, or a migration site that you're finding these particular thresholds of a species. So here you would give a reason why you think the species is aggregating, if for instance it's aggregating, or if it's a refusion, why you think it's a refusion. And if you want to apply B3C, you would be selecting under this column the yes, globally accepted site. And what's the assessment parameter? The density of mature individuals or relative abundance of mature individuals. Again, the source of information for that. And if you're wanting to apply D1B, one of the 10 largest aggregations, you would change this no to yes, justify that the species is aggregated and the source. So if you were entering data for either of these, you would leave these cells on B1, A1, B1, B2, B3, and D blank, and just fill in these relevant cells either for B3C or B1B. Then again, you can put in additional notes to clarify anything for the reviewer for the site. If the trigger element is an ecosystem, you would fill that in here. Make sure that you put this on a separate line to any of the species that you've completed. So you would still use the same site code, but you wouldn't have a species of code. You would then come up with your own code for ecosystems. You put the name of the ecosystem type. If the ecosystem is red listed on the red list of ecosystems, you would give its red list status. And then you would give the global extent to that ecosystem. And you have the options to give a minimum, best, and maximum extent at the site, but quite commonly it would just be one estimate. So you just have one value. And again, don't bother to fill it in the minimum and maximum. And then what's the source? What's where you're getting the information about those ecosystem areas from? If you're applying criterion C on ecological integrity, what's the ecoregion that ecological integrity applies to? How many criterion C sites exist in that ecoregion already? What's the evidence for low human impact? And what's the evidence for intact ecological communities? And these would both be paragraphs that would be used on the KBA fact sheet. In addition to this, we would want a more detailed report justifying why you believe that the site is a site of ecological integrity. And these cells in pink will give you information about the percentage of the global population of the species. These are calculated from the data you've input, percentage of the ecosystem extent, and then also will tell you which of the different criteria and thresholds are met. KBA status. Then in these gray areas, there's comments that can be placed in by the RFPs and reviewers who receive the proposal from you. There's additional cells where you can respond to those comments. And then when it's finally nominated to the KBA Secretariat, there will be potentially some additional comments that will be placed here. You can respond to those comments. And then here we confirm whether the species is, or the ecosystem is confirmed as a trigger element or not for that site. There are three other tables which basically provide information about conservation actions happening at the site. And again, here you would put the same WD-KBA site ID number if it's an existing site, or your code again. So if we put in that one again, get our name, new site, Then you have a list here of conservation actions which are ongoing, and then conservation actions that are needed at a site. These are the standard IUCN lists for conservation actions. Again, it's options for reviewer comments, responses to that, validation and validation comments. We also want to know what the major habitat types are at the site, and there's a list of standard habitat types from the IUCN list. And we also want to know roughly what percentage coverage of each of the habitat types. So you may have site 1 with several different habitat types, and you would select forest, maybe savanna and wetland. And then you would have a percentage cover of each of these. Something like that. And then finally, have some data on threats. So you can have threats that apply to the whole site, or you can have threats that apply to particular species. So if it applied to the whole site, you would leave this species section blank, and then you would select the threats here, and might be biological resource use and hunting and collecting and motivation. And actually, no, probably go. So let's go for unintentional hunting. Say people are snaring. And then you would put in the timing. Is it happening in the past, but now suspended and likely to return, ongoing, only in the future? Scope, affects the whole population, affects the majority of the population, affects the minority of the population. And severity, causing or likely to cause very rapid declines, causing or likely to cause rapid declines, relatively slow but significant declines, fluctuations. That's it. These are standard timing, scope, severity lists that have been used for the important bird and biodiversity areas. If you want to do it specific to a species, you would put in again the same SIS ID number that you've used on the biodiversity elements data, or species ID number from the WDKBA if you've got that, or if it's your own species ID code, then we would put in your one and it would be your new species. Similarly, if you want it to apply to an ecosystem, you would remove that and you would put in the ecosystem code that you put on sheet 3. So again, you should either apply it to the site, to the species, or to the ecosystem on one row, and do it to to both species and ecosystems, or the site and the species on the same row. Just do multiple rows. And that is effectively an overview of the KBA proposal form. If you have questions, please feel free to contact the KBA Secretariat or the regional focal point to find out more about this form. Thank you.